What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of Lords of the Fallen, a reboot of sorts to a 2014 game of the same name that promises to be a next-generation Souls-like that just so happens to be launching a little later today. I'm able to bring you this video the day of because I received a review copy from the developer or publisher CI Games, though I only received that copy just yesterday, so I haven't had a ton of time to play the game, and thus the full review after 100% will be to follow, hopefully within about a week or so, but we shall see. But in any event, I still wanted to share my initial thoughts and impressions after playing the game for a few hours, so let's do just that. This particular title takes place, I believe, like 1,000 years after the first game, in which the demon god Adir was dealt with and sealed away. In the opening cinematic of this title, we see that he managed to break free rather recently, wreaking havoc on the city of Mornstead, where a holy order of crusaders was attempting to seal him away yet again. One of these crusaders, known as the Dark Crusader, carries a magic lamp of sorts that allows them to see into the realm of the dead, or umbral as it's called, a lamp which he loses upon his death, and it manages to wind up with us, which is where character creation kicks off. Character creation is divided up into picking a class and then the cosmetic portion. The cosmetic portion is pretty much what you'd expect, kind of par for the course for Souls-likes these days outside of the ones where you're playing a set protagonist, but you can customize your avatar, if you will, in a multitude of ways with all sorts of different options, though how much you see of that when you're covered in armor is yet to be seen. But let's talk about the classes a little bit. There are 9 total, and these dictate your starting equipment and your starting stats, with most of them, of course, specializing in one particular playstyle or another. And while most of them are pretty self-explanatory, you've got your tanky melee guy, your damage-oriented melee guy, quick and fast, ranged options, the usual stuff. There are a couple I think worth mentioning, which are the Orion Preacher and the Pirate Cultist. These are magic users. They are flagged as advanced classes in character creation because they're a little bit harder to play, apparently. But if you want to start using magic right out of the gate, those are the way to go. And then last but not least, we have the Condemned. This is essentially your classless start, with stats as low as they come, so naturally the hardest way to start the game, but the most customizable option at the same time. However, it is my understanding there are a couple of more classes that are secret that would theoretically be unlocked in some way, for a total of 13. For the most part, though, what I wanted to mention here was that I appreciate the fact that they give you an option to jump right into certain play styles that also comes with a little bit of backstory if you want it, but the main thing here being that you can jump into the magic straight away, which is where your Inferno and your Radiance stats come in. They both scale off of one of those, and then there is a third magic type called Umbral that seems to use both. That said, with this being a Souls-like, we're going to be hacking and slashing our way through enemies, earning a currency which acts as both our XP and our actual currency for vendors that we can then spend on leveling up at certain checkpoints, which are in this case called vestiges, and this is where we can improve our stats. For the most part here, continuing our par for the course Souls-like experience, these stats do exactly what you'd expect. Inferno and Radiance increase the associated magic type. Strength, agility, endurance, and vitality are all very straightforward and do what you would expect them to do. As usual, our weapons scale off of these stats. You need catalysts to cast the spells, and various melee weapons scale off of strength or agility. In most cases, of course, with some of them being geared toward magic users and thus have requirements for Inferno or Radiance. A little bit later into the game, you'll gain access to the ability to upgrade your lantern or your lamp here, in addition to just these regular stats, and then there is also some sort of weapon upgrading I haven't quite got to myself yet, but I do know weapons are upgradable as well. So far, so good as far as progression systems go. All very standard for the genre, I would say. That brings us to the gameplay, though, where I think it gets much more interesting. Now, in terms of level design and things like that, again, very standard Souls-like, at least for the most part, because what this lamp allows us to do is shift in between two worlds, Axiom and Umbral, basically the real world and the spirit world. And this touches basically all of the other gameplay. Oftentimes, to find your way around obstacles or explore levels, you'll need to shift into the Umbral realm and then back to the real world here and there. with this changing the landscape ever so slightly, with things like walls or gates just not being in the umbral version of the world. However, while you're in the Umbral version, you're also being constantly attacked by enemies, and the longer you're there, the more this ramps up with harder and harder enemies coming at you. However, this also leads to increased vigor, as it is called, which is our currency, as the multiplier that we earn it by goes up the longer we are in the Umbral. So if you wanted to grind out vigor, this is kind of how you would do it. And this mechanic is in part what makes up a tutorial that they give you right out of the gate. As soon as the opening cinematics open, you enter into a basic tutorial showing you how the weapons work, giving you time to get comfortable with everything, on top of traversing the world with this sort of shifting between two planes thing. And that right there is already points for me, because most Souls-likes don't bother to give you a proper tutorial, or they do it after the first section of the game. So I'm always a big fan of games that actually start with their tutorial. However, what really stood out to me about this was just how well done the lamp mechanic was, because while you can shift in between these two realms, you can also hold your lamp up to sort of get an initial visual on what is in the Umbral, which will allow you to navigate certain obstacles without actually diving fully into the other plane. However, anything you have highlighted in that lamp's radius is effectively spawned in. This means things like enemies will attack you from it, which I thought was especially cool. And at least here in the early game, how they've worked it into various levels is interesting to me. I'm curious to see if that holds up throughout the entire game, but it is implemented in a much more meaningful way than I really expected it to be. And that's to say nothing of the combat, which makes up the bulk of what a Souls-like tends to be. Now, in some cases, again, I think it's kind of standard Souls-like stuff. If you've played one, you've played many of them, to be sure. However, what really stood out to me about the combat in this particular title is the fluidity of your own movement. I don't know how well that translates to on screen, but all the movement and the way you approach enemies and things felt very, very smooth, with my own clumsiness with the new controls being pretty much the only hiccup. But in terms of combat, we of course have the different types of magic. There are also ranged weapons, and then of course our melee weapons. You can dual wield, and most weapons have multiple stances, if you will, where you can one-hand or two-hand them, which will affect the speed and pace of your own movements. And you can actually string combos together by moving in and out of various stances with certain weapons. And while it doesn't seem to be as complex as something like Neo, which has a whole stance system, there does seem to be an interesting amount of gameplay there for the people looking for it. They also seem to have wanted to make either dodging, blocking, or parrying all viable, whereas many Souls-like these days tend to focus on one of those more than the other. All of them seem to be viable here. Dodging gives you some iframes so you can get through some things. Parrying, which requires precise timing, will help break posture on an enemy, and blocking will reduce the incoming damage, but you take wither damage. Essentially, part of your health bar goes gray, which also occurs when you interact with the Umbral in many cases, but if you hit the enemy while your health bar is like that, you'll get that health back. However, if you get hit while it's active, you lose all of it. So in terms of mitigating what the enemy is doing, all the usual suspects are there, and they seem to have wanted you to be able to actually use all of them. So to wrap this up as far as first impressions go, on one hand, I think a lot of what I'm seeing is very par for the course for a Souls-like. Doesn't really break the mold in a lot of ways. And then on the other hand, there's things I really enjoy, such as the sort of phase shift realm mechanics being implemented in what seems like a really smooth way. On top of things like how responsive the movements of your character are, can feel really rewarding. So as far as a full opinion and the review goes, we'll have to wait and see how exactly some of this stuff holds up over the course of the game, but the initial introduction here is pretty positive. Now, as for the timing, that's a little hard to say. I know there is at least 3 endings for this game, and I'm sure there's plenty of secrets to find as well, so I expect the review after 100% to at least take me probably a week or so, though the nice thing about getting a review key this late is that there's a fair chance the community will have puzzled many of those things out and make them easier for myself. So to wrap this up, first impressions wise, Lords of the Fallen's reboot here is in many ways a pretty standard Souls-like, kind of exactly what you would expect in many instances. However, it does a few things that are particularly interesting, and I think how well those hold up over the course of the game is going to be the determining factor in how well I wind up enjoying this game, which I think is about right for a first impression. So if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know down below how you feel about this particular title. But regardless of all that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.